Hi, Workplace Math 10 students. This is your teacher bringing you a video back at school. We're now currently at school. Hopefully we'll see you in the next few weeks. This video is for the 5th lesson in graphing unit, which we're going to be addressing how to interpret pie graphs. Mathletics refers to pie graphs as sector graphs, so you'll see them as sector graphs there. But let's take a look at what this looks like. So if we go into your Google Classroom, you should see an assignment in there called G5, pie graphs, and then I also called sector graphs. And so basically you're going to be doing that Mathletics assignment. So let's take a look what this looks like. So basically a pie graph is sort of the third type of graph that we'll be looking at in this unit. So we've already looked at line graphs. We just finished looking at bar graphs. And now this is the start of us looking at pie, or what Mathletics calls sector graphs. So what is a pie graph? Well, a pie graph is basically, as the name would suggest, a round graph. And most of the time, these graphs provide information as a total of something. So in other words, you may have $1,000 total to spend, and it will show you as a percentage how much you spent on each particular category of information. So that's what a pie graph represents, and it oftentimes is showing percentages as they relate to a total value. So let's take a look at some examples of what you will see in your Mathletics assignment and see how we can solve for that. So the very first example is a pretty easy one. It says here, what percentage of people preferred baseball? So if we look at this graph, what we can see is that this baseball is distinguished by this color here. This is what we call a legend in a graph, so it kind of lets us know what colors or what patterns represent what particular category. So in this case, this, and I'm not good with colors, but basically sort of a purplish color matches up with this here, hopefully you can see. And so this is suggesting that there are 65% of the people that they looked at here that like baseball, or it's their favorite sport. So this is why, in this particular case, the answer would be 65%. So I don't think that's too hard to understand, but we'll just be moving on to a next sort of comprehension here in a moment. So let's take a look at another example. So the other examples in Mathletics are going to ask you to do a bit of a calculation here. So this question here, it's saying, how much did Susie earn from allowance? So what we have here is that we see that allowance is indicated here with purple. So we see hopefully that Susie earned 40% of all of her money comes from allowances. But we also see down here that it tells us that there's $300 total in income. So what we need to know is we need to know what 40% of 300 is. So we can take 300 and multiply it by the decimal equivalent of 40%. And the decimal equivalent of 40% is 0.4. Now, why is the decimal equivalent of 40% 0.4? Well, remember that a decimal is always, a percentage is always a value over 100%. So it's 40 over 100% in essence. And if we plug that into our calculator, 40, and remember that line here means division, 40 divided by 100, we're going to find out that 40 divided by 100 in our calculator is going to be equal to 0.4, and that's why I got that 0.4 number. So 40 divided by 100 is equal to this 0.4. And so this 0.4 is why I use this here. And when we plug 300 times 0.4, what we're going to find in our calculator is that when I plug that in, it actually comes to a value of 120. So 300 times 0.4 is 120, and that's why this is the answer. So let's just take a look at how we could do that using the calculator. So I'll just switch to my calculator here for a second. So basically what we have here, just so we're clear, 40% over 100% is that 0.4 that I said. So 0.4 is what 40 is, a decimal equivalent of 40%. And then I need to multiply that by the total income I had, which was 300, and that is why I get this value of 120. So that is why when I come back here, and look in here, the answer is 120. So hopefully that makes sense. So let's take a look at a similar example. So looking here, it's asking us how many people preferred purple. Well, in this case, we don't have a legend because they actually give us the color patterns in the pie graph, but we can hopefully see that 20% is the representation here of how many people like purple. Now, what we can also see is that there were 850 people surveyed. So remember that 20%, and I'm just going to show you an easier way possibly of determining what the decimal equivalent of this is. If this is 20% and this is a decimal here, as if we were to have 20 point whatever percent, if we want to convert it to a decimal place, we just shift the decimal 1, 2 over, and then that's why it's 0.2 as well. So what we're going to multiply by here is 850, because that's how many total people we surveyed, times 0.2. And when we plug that into our calculator, we will see that the value that comes from that is 170, and that's why that's the answer. So let's plug this into our calculator though and see how that works. So going back here, just to confirm, if we wanted to know what 20% is, again, we went 20 divided by 100, and that's why we're going to have that 0.2. We're going to multiply it by the number of people that we surveyed totally, which is 850 people. So 20% of 850 people is 170. And that's why we get this value here of 170. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And let's take a look at one last example. So in this case here, it's asking us how many people preferred baseball. So we can see that baseball is, in the legend, indicated by the gray. So what we're seeing here is that 10% of the people surveyed liked baseball. And so what we're going to see here is that when we realize that 400 people were surveyed, we're going to take the decimal equivalent of 10%, which is 0.1, when we shift the decimals, and we're going to multiply that 0.1 by the 400 people that were surveyed. When we do that, we're going to get a value of 40. So that is why we have that answer of 40. Now, if I were to shift back to the calculator and just double check that for you, so remember that 10% as a decimal equivalent is simply 10 divided by 100. So if that's easier for you to do, you can get that decimal equivalent there. You can just multiply it by the number of people surveyed in this case, which is not 400. Let's do that again. So it's 0.1, which was a decimal equivalent of 10%, times 400 people. And so when I plug that in, I get 40. And that is why when we come here, we see that the answer is 40. So hopefully that makes sense. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you fairly soon.